आपने अंग्रेजी और कन्नड़ दोनों में कई किताबें लिखी हैं। आप एक कवि, आलोचक, अनुवादक और सार्वजनिक वक्ता हैं। आप जनपीठ, सरस्वती सम्मान, केंद्रीय साहित्य अकादमी और राज्य साहित्य अकादमी की सलाहकार समिति के सदस्य रहे हैं। आपने 4 दशकों से अधिक समय तक अंग्रेजी और तुलनात्मक साहित्य पढ़ाया है। साहित्य और योगदान के लिए कई संगठनों ने आपको सम्मानित किया है। आपके साहित्यिक योगदान के लिए कर्नाटक सरकार द्वारा वर्ष 2023 में आपको राज्योत्सव पुरस्कार से सम्मानित किया गया। समाज के प्रति आपकी अथक सेवा के माध्यम से मैसूर के सांस्कृतिक जीवन को जीवंत बनाने में आपकी भूमिका अविस्मरणीय रही है। सर, इस कार्यक्रम में आपका हार्दिक स्वागत है, अभिनंदन है और आपके व्याख्यान से हम लाभान्वित होंगे। वेलकम सर।
Thank you very much, sir, for your kind introduction. I'm extremely beholden to you. Now, a brief conversation between Dr. Shivani and I regarding this particular lecture revealed the necessity of breaking the ice between languages. I said we are living in our cozy islands, and she liked the metaphor. In the context of translation, I used we are condemned to live in our arrogant parishes. She liked it, Dr. Shivani liked it immensely, and that is the reason why she said we have to break the ice, because our literatures are so rich and everything should come through English, which is an unfortunate situation. So let us directly expose ourselves to our literature, she said, and I like this wonderful idea. Thank you very much, madam. Kannada is the language of Karnataka, southern state of India, as you all know. It lies between 11.5 and 16.6 north latitudes and 74.2 and 78.4 east longitudes. It has a population of about 60 million people, so one of the major states in India, we can say. The state of Karnataka acquired its present shape and area on the 1st of November 1956, when the map of India was redrawn and linguistic states were formed. Its borders enclose 1/16 of the area of the country. Kannada is one of the Dravidian languages, next only to Tamil in age. It is difficult to determine when Kannada branched off and became an independent language. The word Karnataka, that is the Sanskrit form of Kannada, is found in the Mahabharata. The Kannada word Isila, meaning fort, is found in the Brahmagiri inscription of Ashoka, going back to the 3rd century BC. Ptolemy, who visited India around 150 AD, mentions Badami, Pattadkal, Banwasi, and other cities of Karnataka. Ptolemy, as you know, was an ancient astronomer, astrologer, geographer, and music theorist. And he has mentioned Badami, Pattadkal, Banwasi, and other cities of Karnataka. So this much can be said with confidence that Kannada language goes back to the 4th century BC. The first extant literary work is called Kavi Raja Marga. The work undoubtedly belongs to the Amoghavarsa Nrupatunga, the Rashtrakuta emperor. Amoghavarsa Nrupatunga lived between 1814 to 1879 AD. Karnataka was ruled by so many dynasties, for example, Shatavahanas, the Kadambas, the Gangas, the Chalukyas, and the Rashtrakutas. So this Amoghavarsa Nrupatunga belongs to the Rashtrakuta dynasty, and Kaviraja Marga, the first extant work on poetics, belongs to that particular period. It was authored by Sri Vijaya. The poet's name is Sri Vijaya, And the title of the work is Kavi Raja Marga. Therefore, it is a work on poetics, the kind of discussion on questions of grammar and meter and the range of illustration which we find here would be possible only with a considerable body of creative writing, because some of the works Sri Vijaya mentions in his Kaviraja Marga are not available today, probably that were extant during his lifetime. Kaviraja Marga is a work of immense importance to students of Sanskrit literature as to the students of Kannada literature and language. It has much to say about Sanskrit works like Kadambari and Harsha Charita, and it refers to several Sanskrit poets like Gunasuri, Narayana, and Magha. These are some of the ancient poets who were referred to by Kaviraj Marga, Sri Vijaya. It shows Kannada literature was deeply influenced by Sanskrit literature, but manifesting a spirit of independence. It stresses the importance of freshness and originality. It extols economy of expression, rhythmic pattern, and spontaneity. It extols economy of expression, a rhythmic pattern. It mentions 9 rasas, including Shanti. Shanti rasa is representative of serenity. The work mentions 9 rasas, including Shanti, thus showing the influence of Jaina thought in a way. Dhwani is considered as a figure of speech. As you all know, Rasa Dhwani theory forms the soul of Indian poetics. The work Kaviraja Marga is primarily concerned with poetics, but offers glimpses of contemporary social and religious life as well. It is the work of a poet who is proud of his country, proud of his people, and of his language and literature, and is characterized by a certain warmth. It describes Karnataka as enclosed by the rivers Kaveri and Godavari. It gives us the picture of a people rich and prosperous, interested in the fine arts, and alive to the importance of earthly prosperity, overarched by higher values. So, one of the stanzas in Kaviraja Marga says, a man must earn money, must acquire knowledge, and turn to tapas. After having achieved these twin goals, he must turn to tapas. What does human life mean without these? He asks. Kaviraja Marga makes one conclusion irresistible, and that is by 850 AD, Kannada was not only a well developed language, but also possessed an extensive and rich literature. Pampa was who the Kannadigas revere as Adikavi, the first poet, the poet's poet, himself refers to Munnina Kabbamellam. That means all the earlier poetry. He makes a reference to earlier poets and earlier poetry. From this, it is very clear that he followed a long line of illustrious poets. Those some of the works he mentions are not available today. Now, we from Pampa, we turn to the classical period, which is 850 AD to 1150 AD. That period of 300 years is termed as the classical age. It's a period of literary plenitude, so to say. During this period, as many as 25 poets emerged with 52 works, one after another. Poets went on giving classical works. Also, poets of the stature of Pampa and Ranna. I have already mentioned the first poet, Adi Kavi, is called Pampa, and immediately after him, we encounter another poet equally important, is called Ranna. Pampa and Ranna are very, very important poets. They flourished in this period and gave work like Vaddaradhane is another work, mainly it is the age of Jaina poets and of Champu works. Champu comprise the verse and prose. That's a special type of genre of literature, poetry in Karnataka, in Kannada literature, that is called Champu. It contains both verse and prose. This particular work, Vaddaradhane, is the first extant prose work, which was discovered just a little more than a century ago. That was actually in 1883, only in the fag end of the 19th century. This work, Vaddaradhane, was discovered. The word Vaddaradhane means sadhana, spiritual endeavor and discipline. That's the meaning of the word Vaddaradhane. So the work was probably composed around 920 AD. The author may be Shivakotyacharya. The author of Vaddaradhane is considered to be Shivakotyacharya. The work is a collection of 19 stories, which the author probably took from other sources, all of them concerned with souls, with the experience of a soul realizing the transience of earthly pleasure and glory and awakening to its true nature and destiny. So Vaddaradhane is written in Old Kannada with an admixture of older and newer forms. In fact, Kannada is divided into 3 or 4 phases. Old Kannada to begin with, and then medieval Kannada, and then pre-modern Kannada, and then finally modern Kannada. Sanskrit and Prakrit words are used by the author, who, however, knows the genius of Kannada language. All in all, Vaddaradhane is the work of a man of piety and religion, but one interested in human nature and observant of men's ways and manners. He's a born storyteller and the master of a clear and vivid prose style. That is Vaddaradhane. So from Vaddaradhane, the prose work, we again move on to Pampa, the first poet, Adikavi, belongs to the 10th century, and he inaugurates the central literary tradition of Kannada literature. There is no doubt about it. He inaugurates the central literary tradition of Kannada literature. This tradition flows uninterrupted down to the 20th century, so to say. It recognizes the good things of earthly life and responds to the beauty of the earth and the joy of friendship and love. It recognizes the sweetness of human relations and the demands of moral responsibility. Homer, the great Greek poet, saw man as the plaything of the gods. But Pampa's first epic, Adipurana, stresses man's responsibility. It sets not happiness, but conquest of the senses and doing one's duty as the goal of life. Man has to earn the release from the cycle of birth and death through his own efforts, through purity of life and renunciation. The king of that period, Nripatunga, himself had said, the works of the great poets teach us to distinguish between what is sinful and what is righteous, between what is truly beneficial and what is not, between what brings us happiness and what brings sorrow. Pampa is the first Kannada poet about whose works we can speak with some definite knowledge, hence the reference to him as the Adi Kavi. Apart from Adi Purana, Pampa wrote Vikramarjuna Vijaya, which is a secular work. There is a pattern among the ancient poets of Kannada. They wrote one religious epic and another secular or non-religious epic, as Pampa did. Pampa wrote Adi Purana as a religious epic and Vikramarjuna Vijaya as a secular epic. In Adi Purana, Pampa depicts the spiritual progress of the first Tirthankara. His second epic, Vikramarjuna Vijaya, is popularly known as Pampa Bharata. Curiously enough, the hero of the epic is Arjuna and not Dharmaraya. Pampa takes the story from Vyasa, but he makes his patron Arikesari the hero, identifying him with Arjuna. Just as Shakespeare praised Queen Elizabeth I with genuine admiration, Pampa praised his patron because he believed that Arikesari merited all the praise. Pampa's style is characterized by economy and mystery. He can present a situation dramatically and concretize an experience. In Pampa, Kannada literature saw a major poet with a comprehensive vision which he could embody in a work which achieved contemporary relevance and at the same time could place man against the background of many births or the passing generations and fleeting grandeur. Pampa, Ponna, and Ranna are called the Ratnatraya or three gems of Kannada literature. Pampa and Ranna, I have already referred to. Ponna is another poet, and three of them complete this picture of great tradition. Therefore, they are called three gems or Ratnatraya. Ranna's epic Gadayuddha or Sahasa Bhima Vijaya. It has two titles, Gadayuddha or Sahasa Bhima Vijaya, is full of drama. Pampa shows Duryodhana plunged in grief on the death of Karna. Ranna shows the anguished emperor lamenting by the body of his dearest companion Karna. Ranna's Duryodhana is the first tragic hero in Kannada literature. I think we all know the definition of a tragic hero, right from the Greek tragedies to the Shakespearean tragedies. Now, I take a forward moment to the medieval period where we encounter the great Vachanakaras. The second half of the 12th century and the 13th century witnessed stresses and strains of many kinds in the Deccan plateau. Literature needed a new inspiration. Therefore, at this time, the Virashaiva Vachanakaras appeared. They did not regard themselves as poets as such. They were men and women charged with religious fervor and fierce hatred of sham and superstition. Vachana Sahitya, Vachana literature, is a special growth of the Kannada soil, a lake of which we do not encounter in any other language, in any other literature, so to say. Therefore, it is customary on our part to describe Vachana Sahitya as the special growth of the Kannada soil. Vachana is a prose form of indeterminate length characterized by compactness, which we associate with poetry. It was during the lifetime of Sri Basaveshwara and his contemporaries that Veerashaivism became a dynamic power and swept towards a revolution. The remarkable thing about Vachana Sahitya is that those who created it did not consciously seek to produce literature, but the intensity of their feelings shaped their utterances into literature. These were men and women imbued with unshakable faith in the wisdom, the power, and the mercy of the Lord. They cast aside all differences and distinctions based on caste and wealth. They were men and women unawed by authority, fiercely honest, and uncompromising in their values, but capable of sympathy and tenderness. The greatest of the Vachanakaras is Basavanna. I have already called him Basaveshwara. Basavanna is another name for him, and simply lovingly people call him Basava of the 12th century. He is the greatest Vachanakaras, no doubt. In fact, those of you who are familiar with A.K. Ramanujan's Speaking of Shiva will have acquainted yourselves with the great Basaveshwara, Akkamadevi, Allama Prabhu, Dasimaya, so on and so forth. A.K. Ramanujan, the great translator and poet, has given us succinctly the 12th century Vachana movement, also introducing some of the Vachanakaras and their Vachanas. Some of Basavana's Vachanas express the torment of a mind devoted to the Lord, but dissatisfied with its own state and the doings of the body it inhabits. In one of the Vachanas, Basavana says, "My mind leaps about like the ape on the bow. My mind leaps about like the ape on the bow. It does not let me pause." In another Vachana, he says, "Like a dog in a palanquin, my mind is unable to resist temptation. It leaps towards enjoyment." Yet in another Vachana, he says, "You spread before me the green of sensual pleasure. What can the cow know? The animal takes it for grass." Therefore, in these three vachanas, he has referred to the ape, the dog, the cow, lower order, and hence lacks discrimination. Therefore, I, being a human being, should actually aspire for higher things. But unfortunately, I'm still being attracted by lower order and carnal pleasure. I cannot get over it, he says. Allama Prabhu was another great Vachanakara who said, "The true temple is within the body. What other temple do you need?" And then in another Vachana, he said, "There is an ocean of sorrow for the sake of a mustard seed of happiness. Happiness is as small as a mustard seed, whereas the sorrow is as vast as the ocean. There is an ocean of sorrow for the sake of a mustard seed of happiness," he says. Now, uh, the eternity of the past and the eternity of the future are both contained in one moment, he says in another poem. The eternity of the past and the eternity of the future is contained in one moment. This actually reminds me of the great observation made by the English poet William Blake. He said, "I will show you the world in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour." I think all of you will remember those immortal lines by William Blake, the great mystic 19th century poet. I repeat, he said, "I will show you the world in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour." So when we encounter a line like the eternity of the past and the eternity of the future being contained in one moment by Allama Prabhu, I think we can link both Allama Prabhu and William Blake in one go. That is how the mystics of the world contemplate and try to explain to us the vision of the world. So his imagination, Allama Prabhu's imagination, creates magnificent images. He declares that he and his God would join the earth and the sky, make symbols of the sun and the moon, and play together. So that is the cosmic kind of imagination Allama Prabhu possessed. So from Basaveshwara to Allama Prabhu, we move on to the third luminary of the 12th century Virashaiva Vachana movement, namely Akkamahadevi. Akkamadevi is the radiant figure among the Vachanakaras. In some ways, she reminds us of the Saint Meera of North India and Lal Ded or Lalleshwari, as we lovingly call her, of Kashmir. All of you are familiar, you might have heard of Lal Ded or Lalleshwari. And it is customary in our part to describe Akkamadevi as equal to either Meera or Lalleshwari. She was the daughter of devoted Shiva. The parents were devoted were devotees of Shiva. Akkamadevi made up her mind early in life that she would have no husband except Channamallikarjuna of Sri Shaila. Many Akka's vachanas are autobiographical, and the intense yearning for Channamallikarjuna and the travails of a beautiful young woman who chose an unconventional life and also set out alone on a long journey are mirrored in her poems. She says she has chosen a fearless husband I quote, I loved the handsome one who has no death and no disfigurement, she says. In another Vachana, she says, take away and thrust into the oven these men who are subject to death and decay. Take away and thrust into the oven these men who are subject to death and decay. So some of her vachanas are beautiful love lyrics, but the lyrics sung by one whose passion centers around the immortal master of the universe, Channamallikarjuna. Her language is generally simple, vivid, concrete, and picturesque. It has the power of intense passion and the radiance of genuine experience. The Vachanas constitute a glorious chapter in the history of Kannada literature. Their influence on subsequent writing makes an interesting study. Righteous conduct and moral probity remain the test of man's worth. The achievement and the spirit of Vachana literature influenced the Haridasas who came later. So it is interesting that even those who are either agnostics or atheists have recognized and paid tribute to the moral earnestness, the insistence on purity and rectitude in personal life, and respect for man as man, which characterize the utterances of these fervent devotees of Shiva who are willing to live and to die for God and were intensely religious. After the epoch of the Vachanas, we return to the poetry, and the first poet we encounter is Harihara. That's the name of the poet after the Vachana movement, who wrote a work called Girija Kalyana. Harihara's Girija Kalyana is very famous when he was about 30 years of age or so. Girija Kalyana narrates the story of the marriage of Ishvara and Parvati, Girija, and includes the famous episode of the death of Manmatha. Actually, Harihara is famous for the literary genre called Ragale, which he invented and perfected. That is his individual contribution. The literary genre, poetry genre called Ragale, did not exist before Harihara. It was he who invented this particular genre and perfected it. The protagonists of his poems were great because they had acquired greatness, acquired it through single minded devotion to Lord Shiva. That is, he writes about the biographical details of a series of Shiva Sharanas, the Shiva devotees, and he depicts them with single minded devotion. Harihara taught self respect to the poet and charged his own poetry with the power of freedom. It is a pity that as a poet, he was so little interested in contemporary social life and the challenge of the age. After Harihara, we encounter Raghavanka, another great poet. Raghavanka, the author of immensely popular Harishchandra Kavya. Recently, it has been translated by Dr. Vanamala Vishwanath. It is available in English, a 16th century, 15th, 16th century epic. Harishchandra Kavya, the author of that Kavya is Raghavanka. He was the disciple and nephew of Harihara, a poet who has just now introduced you. Like his great uncle, he vowed that he would not sully his poetry with the praise of mortals. So that is the vow he took. I'm not going to write about ordinary mortals. I'm going to write about those who are dedicated and devoted to Shiva. I'm not going to sully my hand by dipping ink to that he would recognize no God but Lord Shiva. So, for example, this Shiva Hari Hara controversy is very, very thick in all parts of the country, perhaps. Hari, the followers of the Hari are, do not want to say, utter even the name of Hara. When such is the case, Raghavanka becomes another poet who says, I'm not going to write about any other deity except Shiva. That was the vow he undertook. Like Harihara, Raghavanka was a poet with a spirit of independence. He first revealed the power of Shatpadi. I don't know whether you have heard of this form of poetry, 6-line poems, Shatpadi. Shatpadi. After him, other illustrious poets of Kannada, took this form a little further, and they came out with other types of Shatpadis or 6-line poems. Bhamini Shatpadi is one, Vardhaka Shatpadi is another. Like this, there are several Shatpadis, and credit goes to Raghavanka for inventing this particular form of poetry. Shatpadi is a meter which lends itself to description, narration, reflection, and swift dramatic dialogue. That is the advantage of writing poetry in this particular form, Shatpadi. Both Harihara and Raghavanka were original and turned away from the familiar modes to experiment and find their own media. After Harihara and Raghavanka, the next great poet is Kumara Vyasa. Kumara Vyasa lived around 1450 AD. He was a devotee of Sri Veera Narayana of Gadag. Gadag is a place very close to Dharwad in southern part of Karnataka. So Kumara Vyasa is known for his version of the Mahabharata, and Kumara Vyasa's Mahabharata is called Kumara Vyasa Bharata, Gadugina Bharata. Another name of the epic, another title is Gadugina Bharata or Kumara Vyasa Bharata. He has based his story on the first 10 parvas of Vyasa Bharata. As you all know, Vyasa Bharata contains 18 parvas, but Kumara Vyasa confined himself to only the first 10 parvas. Sri Krishna is his hero. He calls his poem Krishna Kathe, that is the story of Krishna. The poet is very modest. He says that actually the poem was composed by the deity Veera Narayana. I am only his scribe. Whatever poem, poetry, whatever epic I have presented to the world, it is all dictated by the great god Veera Narayana. And my role was only that of a scribe. He says, so modest he is. Kumara Vyasa can present powerful situations vividly. In the rich and varied world of men and women, from the great Krishna and the fiery but much endured Draupadi to the tragic Karna and the pusillanimous Uttara, one feels here is God's plenty. What the world created by Kumara Vyasa can be easily described as God's plenty. Such is the variety and vastness of his description. So he is the Lord of the language. He has been very respectfully described as the Emperor of Metaphor. That is the title given by the Rasikas, Sahridayas in Kannada. So Kumara Vyasa is described as the Emperor of Metaphor. Joy and sorrow, anger and contempt, devotion and love, command and persuasion, appeal and sarcasm. Kumara Vyasa's language is equal to the demands of any emotion and situation. So next, if in the 12th century we encounter the Vachanakaras, in the 15th and 16th centuries, another tributary enriched Kannada literature. This was Haridasa Sahitya. Vachana Sahitya, after that, a big milestone that we encounter in our literary journey in Kannada is that of Haridasa Sahitya. The expression Haridasa means the servant of God. These Haridasas regarded bhakti as the way to self-realization and to salvation. The Haridasas were all erudite men steeped in the scriptures, but they were not content with mastering this lore. They sought to carry their knowledge and vision to every hearth and home. That was their goal, not to confine their wisdom within the bounds of a book or something. They wanted to carry the message of Hari Bhakti to every hearth and home. That was their life mission. Religion was to be an illumination and not a dead weight. So they blended reflection and devotion to music, and their songs in simple Kannada carried their message to thousands of people. Even today, our day begins with the Haridasa Kirtana. Like Vachanakara's Vachana, Haridasa Kirtana is the starting point for our day's job. Even today, thousands of homes you are going to hear Haridasa Kirtana. They are alive and kicking. Even after the passage of nearly 600 years, Haridasas like Purandardasa, Kanakadasa, Vyasarad are all alive. Easy to remember and sweet to sing. And here the songs travel fast from person to person. So the great name in Dasa Sahitya is that of Sri Vyasaraya, who lived between 1447 to 1539. Vyasaraya's greatest contributions are Purandaradasa and Kanakadasa. Purandaradasa lived between 1484 to 1564. Kanakadasa lived between 1508 to 1606. With Purandaradasa and Kanakadasa, the Haridasa movement reached its zenith, we can say. Like the Vachanakaras, the Dasas employed Kannada for a variety of purposes, for exposition of philosophy in simple language, for reflection on life, for social criticism, for satire, and lyrical songs. Unlike the Vachanakaras, they were consciously combining literary expression with the discipline of music. Because they combined reflection and music, they were able to reach a wide circle of people, and their literary creations spread fast among the people. Indeed, it is surprising that Purandaradasa was able to harness the spoken idiom of everyday life for so many purposes. For example, the values of right conduct, the devotion of a saint, the vision of an immanent and kindly power, the delights of motherhood, the joy of music, etc., etc. So Purandaradasa employed his kirtanas or the poems to express all these sentiments. So Kanakadasa is as interesting as Purandaradasa. He probably belonged to the shepherd community and therefore did not have the opportunities that the other Haridasas had to study the scriptures or acquire knowledge. And yet, he is one of the greatest Haridasas coming from the subaltern community, the shepherd community. Kanakadasa earned a lot of merit, and although he was deprived of education at the earliest stage of his life, he actually forged ahead and occupied the topmost position because of wisdom and vision. Kanakadasa's total surrender to the Lord has found expression in some moving songs. In a popular song, Kanakadasa points out that God takes care of all created beings like a mother. No doubt Kanakadasa was a Bhakta Kavi, but there is trenchant social criticism in some of his songs as well. Apart from his songs, Kanakadasa also composed long poems, which can be described as epics. The longest of these is Mohana Tarangini. That is the title of the one of the long poems that he wrote, Mohana Tarangini, which narrates the conjugal life of Sri Krishna, his son Pradyumna, and another son, Pradyumna's son, covering 3 generations. Therefore, he calls it Mohana Tarangini. His noted epic Ramadhanya Charitre is an interesting poem which indicates the importance of ragi, the black millet, which serves as the food, poor man's staple diet. Ragi is becoming more and more popular nowadays because people are going after millet, after diabetes and all that. Scientifically, they say it is proved that ragi is very, very important food item. When there is a tussle between rice and ragi, that's the central point of Ramadhanya Charitre. Ramadhanya Charitre. When there is a tussle between rice and ragi about their endurance, ragi wins the test, and this serves as a metaphor for innate superiority of ragi over rice. Now, this analogy of the tussle between ragi and rice extends to clarify the issue surrounding racial superiority or inferiority, a concept that is being discussed even today all over the world, this racial superiority business. So Kanakadas has written a series of poems collected in the book Hari Bhakti Sara, which is the very epitome of implicit faith in God's wisdom and mercy. Therefore, these 101 poems, stanzas, stand out as the best creation coming from Kanakadasa, Hari Bhakti Sara. So I take a big leap from 16th century to the 20th century at this juncture. In the quarter of a century from 1920, Kannada reaped a rich harvest. The preparation of it had taken half a century earlier. Actually, the preparation began somewhere around 1870. 1870 to 1920, half a century of period has been devoted for the preparation of modern Kannada, the beginning of the modern Kannada, so to say, 1920. The society was changing fast thanks to the colonial experience. Most of these changes affected not only people's way of life, but also their way of looking at life, their expectation of life here on earth, and their values. And these in turn shaped a new literature. Democratic values were becoming part of people's experiences. Ideals of freedom, equality, brotherhood, and service appealed to the young minds. Vivekananda, Dayananda Saraswati, and a host of scholars reinterpreted the scriptures and the Bhagavad Gita. The resurgent literary spirit of Kannada manifested itself in the second decade of the 20th century in different parts of Karnataka. Experimentation was in the very air. And while the writers were proud of their mighty predecessors like Pampa, Ranna, Kumaravyasa, Harihara, Raghavanka, so on and so forth, they borrowed new literary forms from the West and made their own. They did not, stick to the old patterns of writing epics. They forged ahead and discovered new things thanks to the Western influence, the colonial influence, so to say. The lyric was no longer the vehicle of religious devotion alone, like Purandaradasa and Kanakadasa did. Its range expanded miraculously. The sonnet, the ode, the elegy, all these literary genres appeared in Kannada. The short story was shaped into a literary form. The novel came to Kannada through English, Bengali, and Marathi literatures, but soon became ready for a magnificent harvest in Kannada language. The personal essay and biography were transplanted. Wordsworth's pronouncements on poetry and poetic diction. We are all familiar with Wordsworth's poetic diction and his preoccupation. He said for the first time that poetry is nothing but man speaking to men. That means an ordinary person speaking to other ordinary people like him. Therefore, there is nothing big about it. Poetry is something which we share among our fellow human beings. Therefore, poetry is man speaking to men, he said. And Matthew Arnold and his solemn and reverential approach to poetry, we are all familiar. And Bradley, A.C. Bradley's interpretation of Shakespearean tragedies all made an impact both on the writer and on the reader. We accepted Matthew Arnold's definition of poetry. We pulsated and responded to Wordsworth's poetic diction and his definition of poetry. And we also turned our attention to A.C. Bradley's definition of Shakespearean tragedy. All these things made an impact on both the writers and the readers. By about 1935, Renaissance literature had blossomed in glory and acquired its distinctive characteristics. Now, as far as the English literature or the European literature is concerned, Renaissance may be 15th and 16th century, but in Kannada, probably in Hindi also, we have an equivalent resurgence of new discoveries of new truths, and poets in their exuberance talked about the value of liberty, freedom, etc., etc. Because of the colonial moorings, they wanted to break away from the break their shackles and break away from their past experiences and come out with new experience and share their new ideas with their fellow human beings. That is 1935 and thereabouts. Renaissance literature had blossomed in glory and acquired its distinctive characteristics. Literature used to be about gods and goddesses. Probably this is the pan-Indian phenomenon observable in other literatures as well. Therefore, we used to talk about more and more about gods and goddesses and saints and the great ones. Now, in the changed times, literature was concerned with the passions and dreams and fortunes of all men and women. Increasingly, we begin to place men and women at the center of action, removing gods and goddesses from our scheme of things. Literature also became interested in human nature, its mysteries and oddities. Dattatreya Ramachandra Bendre, simply D.R. Bendre, and he loved to call himself Ambika Tanaya Datta. Dattatreya Ramachandra Bendre wrote under his poetic name called Ambika Tanaya Datta. He lived between 1896 and 1981. He was the second poet to get the Bharatiya Jnanpith. The first poet was Kuvempu. He got the Bharatiya Jnanpith in 1969. Bendre got a couple of years later. These were the earlier harvester of Jnanpith Award. And Ramachandra Bendre, Ambika Tanaya Datta, shot into fame with the recitation of his magnificent poem called Hakki Haratide Nodidira. That is the title of the Kannada poem, Hakki Haratide Nodidira. Simply means, did you see the bird on its flight? He wrote this poem in 1929, and in the Belgaum Kannada Literary Conference, his wizardry in the use of language was what struck the reader first. Those who heard the poet actually, became absolutely mad after Bendre, because now they realize on the horizon there is a new poet emerging who uses the language in a different way altogether. That's the reason why I said wizardry in the use of language. A magician is born, they said. The words danced, they sparkled, they set up enchanting rhythms. The assimilating energy of his poetry, the fusion of thought and feeling, the vision of a cosmic energy permeating all universe, the exploitation of all the resources of the language, and the superb mastery of rhythm and meter, all these have made him one of the great poets of India in the 20th century. Not only Kannada poet, but he can be described as the 20th century, one of the greatest 20th century Indian poets. So From Bendre, we move on to K.V. Puttappa, that is Kuvempu. Kuvempu is his pen name. Another great writer of the 20th century. He gave the redoubtable epic Sri Ramayana Darshanam, for which he was conferred Jnanpith Award in 1969. Just now I said, the poem Sri Ramayana Darshanam is a vision of the evolution of perfect human personality. Rama is not just the incarnation of Mahavishnu, but he evolves in the course of the epic Sri Ramayana Darshanam. Rama evolves gradually, so to say. So here is a vision of the pilgrimage of the human soul. A number of poets in the Navodaya period, this Renaissance period, the first couple of centuries of the 20th century, first couple of decades of the 20th century is described as the Navodaya period or the Renaissance period of Kannada literature. A number of Navodaya poets, the poets belonging to the first couple of decades of the 20th century, enriched Kannada poetry through their inimitable contribution. Now, from poetry, if you turn our attention to the domain of fiction, the field of fiction, has been greatly enriched by writers like Dr. Shivaram Karanth. He also got the Jnanpith Award. Shivaram Karanth made immense contribution, and Karanth's quest of values led him to the affirmation of meaningfulness of life. That is Karanth's contribution. He is strictly secular. Dr. Shivaram Karanth is strictly secular, but with a genuine appreciation of the lives of those who live by the values of religion. He does not wear his religion on the sleeves, as we say. He will not exhibit it, display it willingly, deliberately, but through his characterization, by portraying certain characters who uphold values, he's projecting the meaningfulness of life. So coming back to Kuvempu again, he's the author of two great novels in Kannada. Of course, Dr. Shivaram Karanth did not stray to poetry or other forms of genres of literature. He was greatly wedded to the form of fiction. That's why he has enriched Kannada fiction to a great extent. Kuvempu, on the other hand, went on experimenting with almost all the genres of literature. And he came out with two great novels called Kanuru Subbamma and Malagalali Mudumagalu. Kanuru Subbamma, 1936, Malagalali Mudumagalu, 1967. Fortunately, both these novels have been translated into English. Recently, Malagalali Mudumagalu was translated by Dr. Vanamala Vishwanath, one of our very important translators. Very recently, the last month, I think, December, it was published. Anyway, and then Kuvempu, although he's concerning himself with Malenad region of Karnataka, Shivamogga, Tirthalli, and so on and so forth, his idea is to, even through portraying the farmer community of people, in the back of beyond, as we say, his idea is to reflect the universal truths. So therefore, there is nothing like parochial or regional about it. Even while dealing with the regional aspect of lives of certain farming community, Kuvempu, because of his great vision, is giving us the picture of the world. Therefore, these two novels can be described as epic novels. And the credit should go to Kuvempu for coming out with epic novels for the first time in Kannada. And very many contemporaries of Kuvempu started imitating him. And another contemporary, the great professor Vinayaka Krishna Gokak, in short, V.K. Gokak, he kept Vinayaka as his pen name. And V.K. Gokak wrote an epic novel called Ijodu. It grew to become a 7-volume novel. It stretched to 7 volumes. Ultimately, we have this 1,500-page novel. Probably V.K. Gokak was influenced by Kuvempu. He wanted to come out with an epic novel. And remember, it is the same V.K. Gokak who gave us another epic, probably following in the footsteps of the senior poet Kuvempu. Kuvempu came out with Sri Ramayana Darshanam, that is the 20th century first epic in Kannada. And Vinayaka Krishna Gokak wanted to imitate Kuvempu probably. He came out with Bharata Sindhu Rashmi. He takes us back to the Vedic times, and all his characters belong to that time, and therefore he has given us another epic, Bharata Sindhu Rashmi. Now, I turn my attention to a great Kannada short story writer who was contemporary of Dara Bendre, Kuvempu, Vinayaka Krishna Gokak, Masti Venkatesha Iyengar, another Jnanapitha awardee, is the first big name in the realm of the short story. Some of his stories could deservedly find a place in any anthology of world stories. Now, it is customary on our part to come across anthologies of world famous short stories. But according to critics, yes, some of Masti Venkatesh Iyengar's short stories are fit enough to be among the greatest short stories of mankind. So his kindly humor and his mellow wisdom are present in almost all his short stories. He was a master who made the short story the vehicle of a vision. See, the Navodaya writers, the Renaissance writers, the writers belonging to the first 2, 3 decades of the 20th century, did not adopt a label and did not regard themselves as writers of a single school. They were not conscious of the fact that future critics are going to label us as Navodaya writers. They did not have this in mind with certain objectives and do's and don'ts. They did not have this image. Subsequently, new creeds and schools appeared, and these directed severe attacks against the Navodaya writers. Now, that's a strange phenomenon, probably existing in other literatures as well. Even after the passage of Navodaya writers' time, come 1950s and 60s, we have another school of thinkers and writers who said Navodaya writing is not that great. All our Kuvempu, Mastis, Bendres, etc., they did not encounter life, they did not reflect life as it should have been. They said, however, we shall not forget the fact that these Navodaya writers imbued Kannada literature with a new spirit of secularism, humanism, and modernity without breaking away from a central tradition. In a way, Navodaya writers gave us the continuity, some thread to connect with our past, with our tradition. Therefore, however much the modernist writers, condemn them or say come out with the negative comments, the Navodaya writers have their importance in the scheme of things. Prose employed by these writers I mentioned, whether it is Masti or Kuvempu or Gokak, these prose gained range, flexibility, elegance, and lucidity. If you want to learn good Kannada, we must go back to these past masters who have given us an excellent model of good prose. Kannada literature has seen the emergence of progressive movement. Immediately after the Navodaya writers, we encounter the progressive writers because the progressive movement was very much alive in the West, represented by the Marxists, Leninists, etc., etc. And our writers were greatly influenced by the Russian literature, and Russian literature was very popular, and therefore the Kannada progressive writers were very much influenced by the Russian writers. And we have the famous Hindi writer Prem Chand as an example of the progressive movement. After the progressive movement, immediately we encounter the modernist movement. Modernist writers were greatly influenced by Camus, Kafka, Sartre, etc., all these continental writers. In a way, Camus' Outsider appealed to the modernist writers, and therefore the existentialist writers became very influential among the modernist writers of Kannada. We have all heard of Dr. U.R. Ananthamurthy and many other writers actually became the torchbearers of the modernist movement. They, in fact, took a diametrically opposite position from Navodaya writers. They said they only to invoke a phrase from P.B. Shelley. Matthew Arnold described the Romantic poets as the ineffectual angels beating their wings in the void. That is a famous quotation from Matthew Arnold, who described the Romantic poets, the poets of the first decades of the 19th century, as ineffectual angels beating their wings in the void. More or less, the modernist writers in Kannada language, tried to borrow those phrases of Matthew Arnold and started describing the Navodaya writers as ineffectual angels. That is not true. I have already established how useful they have been through their prose, writing crisp, flexible prose, etc. And after the modernist movement, we have the protest movement and another Dalit movement. Almost simultaneously, the protest movement and the Dalit movement came into existence. Each one of these movements have seen a line of staunch writers. For example, the progressive writers concentrated on the economic aspect of life. That's the reason why they were influenced by Marxists. Economic aspect became the ruling principle for them. And then the modernists wanted to break away from both the Renaissance and progressive writers to reflect the modern man's angst and alienation. The angst and the alienation were bandied about by the existential writers, the theory of absurdity, etc., you are all familiar with. Now, modernist writers broke away from both the Renaissance writers and the progressive writers. They wanted to establish angst and the spirit of alienation as the ruling passion, ruling sentiments that is their preoccupation. Next, the protest movement made direct action as its creed in order to bring succor to the voiceless. So until now, there has been the dominance of the dominant caste and segments of the society. They're exploiting the poor, the marginalized, and the voiceless. Therefore, we must protest, they said, and started writing that kind of literature, which is later on came to be labeled as protest literature. The point is direct action is the central concern of the protest literature. Now, Dalit literature brought to the fore the issues of untouchability and the ways to combat exploitation of the downtrodden. Since centuries, we have been relegated to the background, and Manusmriti described us, Manu, the great Manu, described us as people who are the scum of the society. We do not count in the scheme of things the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Shudras, etc., occupy some position of importance in society. But the Panchamas, we do not belong anywhere. Therefore, we must assert our existence, they thought, and came out with their brand of writing. So Dalit writing has become very predominant in the latter part of the 20th century and now in the 21st century. it has become almost a pan-Indian phenomenon, and Dalit writing is gaining its momentum. For example, a poet like Siddhalingaya, Dr. Siddhalingaya, has drawn our attention to the plight of the Dalits and makes us empathize with their issues. In poetry, Dr. Siddhalingaya's name, and now there are a host of poets in contemporary Kannada scene. Dalit poets are coming out with their own creations, and they are making experiments with the genre of poetry. Those trenchant, loud, coarse utterances have gone almost, and there is a subtle way of dealing with the language, figure of speech, metaphors, and there is a subtlety which was unheard of earlier. As far as the short fiction genre is concerned, Devanur Mahadeva, that is a name which is very familiar to even non-Kannada speaking people. Mahadeva brings home the suffering of the helpless and the exploited. The feminist approach to literature by women writers and poets is very much alive in Kannada. Some of the women's poetry reflects a sure leaning to radical feminism shown by the Western feminists. Okay, the Western feminism has seen all brands of feminism, and Kannada feminists also have taken a leaf out of their experience. And it is not impossible to find some very radical Kannada women poets. But most of the women writers in both fiction and poetry register their protest against patriarchal dominance and demand sufficient space in the sun and their portion of the fruit. So they have been able to find their voice, and they have added their share to the spectrum of Kannada literature. Most of the women poets have derived inspiration from the 12th century saint Akkama Devi, because just now I gave you a glimpse of Akkama Devi, the great 12th century saint poet. Even the 20th century women poets, 21st century women poets have derived a lot of inspiration from Akkama Devi, and then they are almost continuing the same line of argument, we can say. Considering the long journey of Kannada literature over several centuries, we can infer that good life was seen as attainable through the tireless pursuit of abiding values. What we describe as good life, according to Kannada literature, is attainable. It is not impossible to attain this good life through the tireless pursuit of abiding values. That is important. If we throw away the discipline and value, nothing remains. Our poets and saints all along have reminded us of the importance of being rooted to one dear perpetual place, and also to discover certain values which are enduring, abiding, and which enhance and enrich the quality of human society and also the individual human beings. Modern man has taken on himself the responsibility of identifying his own ethical values and defining his destiny. He is absolutely and acutely aware of the fact that in order to redeem ourselves, we have to work out our salvation. That kind of responsibility is always there in the mind of our writers. We have to work out our salvation. No external agency can help us in this regard. They are very, very aware of this. We seldom pause to think of the magnitude of the challenge, because when the individual becomes responsible for his action, the challenge becomes all the more acute. So literature is one of the means available to modern man to probe life, to experience in his very flesh and bone the complexity of life. That is the demand. We have to experience the complexity of life in our very flesh and bone, to stand at a distance from it and gain perspective and to come to terms with it. Every new movement, every new writer, just now I talked about Navodaya movement, Navya or modernist movement, progressive movement, which is called Pragatishila. Navodaya, Navya, Pragatishila, Bandaya, Dalit. Dalit and Bandaya, they are almost, they are twins, so to say. They came into existence almost simultaneously. So, Navodaya, Navya, Pragatishila, Dalit, Bandaya Sahitya, and then feminist literature, Mahilavadi Sahitya. All these movements, every new movement, every new writer has to be aware of this responsibility and to be judged in its own light. As you saw, I have jumped many centuries in between. I began with Vikramarjuna Vijaya, then I moved over to Pampa, Ranna, Ponna, Kumarvyasa, earlier Hariyara, Raghavanka, then Kumarvyasa, and so many other poets I referred to. And then I jumped several centuries, as you saw, in the process of tracing the major trends and contours of Kannada literature. I was able to do just that because of the time constraint, but I hope I have been able to give you a sense of the magnitude and vastness of Kannada literature. However, I'm guilty of not quoting some verses and statements of a few more poets and writers. I gave you the glimpse of Basaveshwara's Vachanas, Alluma Prabhu's Vachanas, and Akkama Devi, but I wish I had given you some poems of Kumarvyasa and Pampa, very great teachers of our society. I would have required at least double the time I was allotted. But I'm really thankful to Dr. Shivani and the professor and head of the department for this opportunity. Her words that, Dr. Shivani's words, that we, the people of India, are condemned to live in self-created islands. I said at the beginning that we are condemned to live in our arrogant parishes. Unfortunately, not many of us are aware of the richness of the bhashas, the Indian languages. I'm not aware of the great poetry of Punjabi literature, Punjabi poetry, Punjabi language, and so also most of you are not aware of the richness of Kannada literature. Now, by breaking the ice in this fashion, we can build a bridge between our cultures and languages. I think that is the only way, through interaction, we can gain some insights to our respective languages and literatures. So I thought I should pitch in and contribute my share, however meager it is, because we must make an honest attempt to rectify the situation. If we allow the situation to continue in this fashion, that mutual ignorance persists, and finally we will be condemned to live in our little small islands. That should not be the case. It is in this background that I jumped at the opportunity. I'm happy if some names of the poets and writers and some literary movements have stuck in the minds of the audience. I'll be immensely happy if some of you are egged on to learn more about Kannada literature in general and some poets and writers in particular. I think I will stop at that because this monologue may be very fatiguing. It may tire you. Therefore, if there are any questions and observations, I'll be very happy to respond to that. We have
not at all tiring, sir. Not at all. It was really peaceful.
Thank you very much.
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर.
Thank you, sir.
जी.
हमारे किसी साथी के मन में कोई प्रश्न है तो सर से पूछ सकते हैं.
Yes, sir. Very good morning, sir.
Very good morning, sir.
I am Wali R from Karnataka. I am doing my PhD in Mysore University under the guidance of Dr. Shasina Begum.
Oh, wonderful, sir. Wali sir, boliye. Oh, wonderful, great.
Sir.
Shasina Begum happens to be my colleague, my friend.
Answer.
Yeah. Great to hear that.
Okay, sir. Sir, my question is,
Hmm.
yes, sir. What is the major contribution of Kannada literature to the world? One. And another one,
Yeah.
say the contribution of Tattvapadas to the Kannada literature.
Right.
Yes, sir.
So,
Say
could you-
about Tattvapadas and the major contribution of Kannada literature to the world.
As far as the first question is concerned, I started my lecture by making a reference to Pampa. If you can recall,
Yes, sir.
Manava Kulam Vande Valam. You understand
Yes, sir.
the meaning of
Wonderful.
that wonderful statement coming from our Adi Kavi. He declared
Yes.
to the whole world that the quintessence of Kannada literature is Manava
Yes.
Kulam Vande Valam. The
Wonderful.
whole
Yes, sir.
humanity is one. What more message do you want to have? And this thing is bandied about now in Sanskrit, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Vasudha eva Kutumbakam. Entire world is a family. They say in Sanskrit, some
Yes.
1,000 years ago, our Adikavi, Pampa, declared to the whole world, the entire world is one. I think we have to rediscover the meaning of this philosophy because the contemporary world has gone mad. The contemporary,
Yes.
the present world has gone mad, and there is war everywhere. There is battle going on. Violence is, predominant in the whole world. Man appears to have lost his, moorings. Therefore, once again, by listening to such poets as Pampa, we can really discover the truth that the entire world is one family. Manava Kulam Vande Valam. As we have seen right from 10th century Pampa to the present age, 21st century, all our great poets, novelists, thinkers, philosophers have emphasized and re-emphasized the truth that we cannot live in small little islands. For example, even while describing small little world of Malnad, Kuvempu, wide opens very wide and asks us to take this world as one family. Especially in his poetry, for example, Vonanna Chetana, Aguni Ani Ketana, that wonderful poem, he gave the mind to become, Vonanna Chetana. So that is the message, that is the contribution we can give to the whole world. Kannada literature, that is the contribution of Kannada world. Regarding the second question, Tattva Padakaras, their contribution is absolutely immense. For example, they were inspired mystics and poets. Many of them were not literate. Sakshara Allayirbodu. Many of the poets were not literate. What they wrote, what they sang was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. What Wordsworth described poetry as. Wordsworth described poetry as the spontaneous feelings of powerful, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Wordsworth said, Tattva Padakaras in a similar way sang spontaneously because they wanted to provide corrections to this excesses of the society. They observed the society as Shishta Kavis, as formal poets. Because of the native wisdom, Tattva Padakaras poured their soul out and gave new direction to the society. And each poem contains a wonderful, lasting, enduring message. And that's the reason why in Karnataka, Tattva Padakara's literature is revered, valued, and the government of Karnataka has come out with 38 or 40 volumes of Tattvapadas. That is the immense literature that exists. The oral literature. The people passed this Tattvapadas oral poems from generation to generation by word of mouth. And now that particular genre of literature in Kannada is, separate genre, and some 30 or 40 volumes government of Karnataka published some years ago. And that is the value of Tattvapadas. They continue the message and philosophy of the formal poets. If Pampa says, Manava Kulam Vande Valam, the entire family, the world is one family, Tattvapadakaras more or less turn our attention inwards. They address the soul. They appeal to the soul, the mind, and asks the soul to go on a proper path for achieving individual salvation. Achieving individual salvation automatically means achieving the salvation of the larger society, because the good of the society is contained in the good of the individual. That is what our Tattvapadakaras preached and practiced. Great literature, in fact. In Kannada, Tattvapada literature is a wonderful literature.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other observations, questions?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I think you have forgotten the names of Girish Karnad and U.R. Ananthamurthy. Where do you place in this?
I refer to Dr. Ananthamurthy while I dealt with the modernists or the Navya movement in Kannada. After Navodaya, we have Pragatishila. After Pragatishila, we have Navya. After that, almost simultaneously, Dalit and Bandaya movement take birth. And then feminist response to the world around us. So while referring to modernist movement, I invoked the name of my revered teacher, Dr. Yoran. He was my teacher also in the university for 3 years. And Ananthamurthy's samskara is well known to the outside world, where he wanted to, give a new turn to the tradition. He was a critical insider. He wanted to take stock of Hinduism and what are the lacunae, the negative aspects of Hinduism through the characters of Narayanappa and Praneshacharya. As we have read that novel, I suppose, he comes out with an alternative perception of the world view. So the entire traditional thinking, he turns it around on his head and therefore comes out with a new perspective. As far as Girish Karnad is concerned, he went back to the Vedas sometimes to deal with his earlier, at least the earliest novel, play called Agnimathu Male, the rain and the fire and the rain. He went to the Vedas, he culled out some stories from the Puranas, and then he gave modern interpretation to the whole thing. Therefore, I consider the contribution of Ananthamurthy and Girish Karnad as, in a way, a continuation, but in another, from looking at the same thing from another aspect, it is a reaction to the traditional view of life. They provide some kind of counterpoint or a reaction to. That's the reason why Kannada literature becomes very, very rich. They did not simply accept whatever worldview passed on from the senior writers. They stopped, they took a pause, and then questioned the realities of life. And therefore, this modernist movement is also very important movement, as important as Navodaya. Adiga, Gopal Krishna Adiga, as a poet, gives another alternative point of view. In fiction, Dr. Ananthamurthy is a representative of the modernist movement. In poetry, I think the originator of the modernist movement in Kannada literature is Dr. Gopal Krishna Adiga. And he went to the extent of declaring that poetry represented by the Navodayas is not real poetry. What I am writing